Colonel, hello. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to have you. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us.
Sure, it's good to be back.
Thank you, Doug. I'd like to let our audience know that today we have the honor of speaking with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He is a decorated war veteran, participant of the war in the Gulf. He is a political commentator and analyst, and a former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you, Colonel.
Yeah, super. It's good to be with you as well.
This crazy roller coaster we're on. I wonder what it really, you wake up every day and you're wondering what's going to happen next, because everything you knew about the international relations theory or practice or national security as we knew it, everything just went out the window. Just very briefly, I studied in the US, best years of my life, studied with some remarkable people at Stanford, really the best years of my life. But it seems that while the US had some of the best experts in IR in the world, it had absolutely no bearing on the foreign policy of the United States. And as we look back at the last 25 years of US foreign policy, it strikes me as completely erratic. It's something I cannot explain, and it's certainly not successful. What is going on, Colonel?
Well, I think it's very clear that we have no coherent national strategy of any kind, whether it's military, scientific, industrial, economic. It doesn't matter. There is no coherent military strategy at all, no coherent national strategy. As a result, we go through these convulsive periods that alternate between euphoria and despair. And we wake up, as we have recently within the last 24 hours, to discover that once again, uh, channels other than those that we are accustomed to, in other words, involving this man, Mr. Witkoff, the real estate billionaire who is friends with President Trump, seems to have been at work behind the scenes to try and craft some sort of solution that both President Putin and President Trump could support for Ukraine. Now, there's people are talking about 20-point plan and all sorts of things. I really don't know the details. And unless you are on the inside of this little cabal in the White House that cooks these things up and then is blessed by Trump to implement them, you really don't know the details. The only thing we can say is that President Trump wants to end the war, but he wants certain things. And people need to understand this about him. This applies to any discussions, as you've already seen, between Azerbaijan and Armenia. He wants to be seen as having been the great bringer of peace, goodness, and wonderful things. In other words, the optics have to be flattering to Donald Trump. He has to appear to be the main driving force behind whatever occurs. I think Mr. Putin has frankly accommodated this for a long time because he too would like to see the war end. He is by no means desperate per se, but he would also like to have a better relationship with Washington. And so if he can sign on for something that brings the fighting in Ukraine to an end, but at the same time establishes a new and more positive relationship with Washington, I'm sure that Mr. Putin will try to achieve that. Now, beyond that, what does it mean? Does it have legs? Will it work? Who knows? I mean, the regime inside Kiev is arguably one of the most corrupt and despicable regimes in modern human history.
Mm.
I mean, our friend Zelensky has stolen over $1 billion in cash, sitting in multiple bank accounts in various places. There have been rumors lately that he's prepared to leave the country on a moment's notice. People thought he might not come back from his trip to Greece. Two of his inner circle members, if you will, one was named Mindich, who is a sort of a financial guru for Mr. Zelensky. Another gentleman whose name escapes me. Both fled to Israel because, as Jews, they cannot be extradited. Mr. Zelensky is also Jewish, so I don't think we should rule out the possibility that he flies to Israel to cover himself and conceal himself from public view when the time comes. Who knows? Uh, for one, would like to see an end to the war because it's pointless. It has never made any real sense. And the Ukrainian nation per se has been destroyed.
Yes.
This is something people don't understand. I mean, it really has. The deaths are in the millions, refugees in the millions. We don't know whether or not there will even be a Ukraine once the fighting ends. Now, the question is, what will Russia accept? Can Russia live with a regime in Kiev that is hostile to it? I don't think so. Can they live with this sort of bizarre Zelensky character or successors from his regime who are going to continue, and frankly speaking, providing cover to NATO to place weapons and other things on Ukrainian soil? We don't know any of this. All of these things had to be addressed, and Witkoff apparently is in the business of addressing them. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But don't exclude the possibility that it all of a sudden simply collapses. You know, unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And you know what they say when you have no strategy? It's sort of like saying, well, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Well, yeah, quite so. If we want to build a conjecture about the possible terms for this peace agreement, I mean, Crimea is probably not something that Russia is going to negotiate.
Oh, no.
The four regions are probably something that they will probably not negotiate. So would it be sensible to say that perhaps there would be an agreement to freeze the current front line, and then, but then would it not make sense to make sure that on the other side of that front line there would not be a buildup, a huge military buildup? Because I don't think some people in Europe would waste a second until they start building factories and importing military equipment and military technologies, and Russians will probably do the same. So we'll just freeze the conflict to turn it into a big barrel, a gunpowder barrel that will explode in a few years, and probably in a much worse way. Is there a way to prevent this from happening?
You know, this is the question that none of us can answer at this point. Clearly, from the Russian standpoint, you've argued for a very, very stringent outcome. You cannot end this war and allow the remnants of this regime to survive intact. I just don't think you can. You've got to have some kind of house cleaning. You need, we could certainly hold elections in Ukraine. All sorts of things could change. But what will the Europeans do? The Europeans don't have much to do anything with. I mean, militarily, they have no impact. It's ridiculous. Now they can provide Storm Shadow missiles or Taurus cruise missiles or something, and that's more of an irritant than a strategic game changer. But it's still a problem because the Russians are not going to put up with that for very long. And I think the Europeans, frankly, when I say Europeans, I should stop and say not Europeans, but the globalist elites governing Europe. Because I think the French, the British, the Germans, and others in Europe have had it with the EU and NATO, to be perfectly blunt. I think those two institutions will crumble and go out of existence whenever this fighting really finally ends. Doesn't have any future. But having said that, I think the globalists would like to perpetuate in any way possible hostility with Russia, because that, in their minds, helps to justify their positions in power. I mean, how could you turn around if you're Merz or Macron or Starmer and say, oh, by the way, we were wrong. Russia really isn't the threat we said it was. The Russians are not coming west. They're not going to camp on the banks of the Rhine River. That's all nonsense. We think we can come to an agreement. Well, that's very difficult for them to do. And that makes it very hard on President Trump, because President Trump doesn't seem to have the authority or the will to impose what he wants on the Europeans. And I think that's something that President Putin has counted on. Hasn't happened. I mean, I cannot imagine anybody in the previous, certainly 30 years ago, in Europe standing up to the President of the United States and saying, no, Mr. President, we don't want Germany reunified. We don't want any change in NATO, or on and on. It's just impossible. We don't seem to have that kind of influence in Europe anymore. And by the way, we're not even sure that President Trump can impose very much on the House or the Senate, because the people that really control the House, the Senate, and ultimately the White House are agents of Israel. Now, that means that Zelensky Zelensky, in particular, is connected to Israel and connected to New York City and the banks in London. Are they prepared to go along with a peace agreement that President Trump hammers out that may be more favorable to Russia than they would like it to be, because they all seem to be in a state of permanent hatred and hostility for Russia? Yeah, I just think at this point, let's see what happens. We certainly hope for an end to this disaster. Today, a friend of mine who's paid more attention to these things lately than I have sent me a note reminding me that today was the end of the Somme offensive in 1916. And that caused 420,000 casualties in the British Army, 200,000 casualties in the French Army, and 440,000 casualties in the German Army.
Over a million.
So I guess from the standpoint of the Germans, they won because they inflicted more damage on the British and the French than was inflicted on them. But then you stop and you ask the question, what was achieved by the losses of all those lives? And I think we can say comfortably in retrospect, not much. But of course, here's something else that needs to be borne in mind. When that ends, there begins in London, it was already underway, but now it really begins a very deliberate effort to drag the United States into the war, because it becomes clear in London and Paris that without our entry into the war, they are not going to win. And so this is the beginning of everything that goes wrong in the history of European civilization, in my judgment. We get into it. We should never have gone into that war. The British were insane to do it. We were even dumber to do it. And once we got into it, we made a mess of it because we had a president who simply didn't understand Europe, didn't understand the world, and thought that he was God and would impose his solutions on the rest of the world. We're still in Europe. We're still in the Middle East. All of these places. Somebody pointed out to me the other day, and I think this is something Americans can't even begin to imagine, but at Versailles, people representing Syria, in other words, indigenous people, the people that lived in Syria, inquired whether or not the United States could receive the mandate for Syria instead of the French. And they were asked why. Well, we trust Americans. And we think the Americans want what's best for us. I mean, just stop and think, can you find anybody in the Caucasus or the Middle East who's prepared to stand up and say such a thing to us today? It's tragic. So we're at the end of this long period of misery and misfortune, 100 years plus, and we see no immediate end in sight. So the possibility that something good comes out of the back channels between Putin and Trump, through their intermediaries, obviously, is something we should all welcome. But we have to be reasonable in our expectations. We have to suppress them, if you will, and keep in mind that even if everything seems to work out right at the last minute, it could all fall apart. And the question, of course, for you is, what does this mean for Armenia?
Yes.
Does Armenia fall into this confusing mix? Because one of the things that was pointed out today, I was astonished anybody would say it, said, well, after President Trump's successful ceasefire in the Middle East, this is a new opportunity for greater peace and cooperation, and it results from yet another ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. I don't see any ceasefire working at all in the Middle East. The Israelis bombed Lebanon again. One wonders, what are we doing that for? Of course, it doesn't make much difference what we think because the Israelis are in charge. Somebody sent me an interesting cartoon. It says, the president we voted for, and it shows a picture of Donald Trump. The president we got, it shows a picture of Netanyahu. I mean, this is the sort of undercurrent of discontent in the United States now, which is quite profound. But we are no more able to influence what happens in Washington as a people right now than, say, the Mexicans are to influence their own government, which really isn't in control of Mexico either. I mean, this is a just incredible set of circumstances. Whoever you think is in charge really isn't in charge. So if President Trump really isn't in charge, and you have a collection of billionaires, 6, 7, 8 billionaires with enormous quantities of money who've effectively purchased the government and policymaking, What can you reasonably expect to happen? Anything good? Can we come to some sort of arrangement with Iran? Doubtful. Can we prevent more war breaking out in the Caucasus? Now, obviously, if we can reach some sort of agreement with the Russians in Ukraine, I'm sure someone in the background is saying, well, if you ease up on the Russians in Ukraine, that will give them greater freedom of maneuver in the Caucasus. Do we want that? As
Mhm.
though we have a permanent interest in harming Russia, which we don't. There's no strategic benefit to us from harming Russia. And then in the background, you have this thing called Venezuela. And everybody knows that the fentanyl comes into the United States via Mexico.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that the cartels in Mexico are dangerous and a serious problem. But then you have people that stand up and say, well, let's go bomb Mexico. I mean, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. No one wants to say we should protect our borders. We should shut down the drug and human trafficking coming up through the land borders and coming in from coastal waters. And then we should have harsh penalties for people involved in this. So I'm a big believer that if you are caught red-handed involved in child trafficking or drug trafficking inside the United States, you should be tried. And if you're found guilty, you should be executed. And every policeman I've talked to, everyone in law enforcement, everyone has said, absolutely, that will stop it. And I said, well, great. Then why won't it happen? My assumption is there are people in Washington that must benefit from the illegal human trafficking and drug trade too. But of course, I can't prove that. But why would you not want something like that? And then, of course, you have the usual groups of, I'm a libertarian. I don't believe in that. That's not nice. Nice has nothing to do with it. It's the survival of your country. But instead, you have the other problem in the United States. It's what I call the bombs away club.
That's my favorite.
Yep. Now, oh, that's great. Let's go bomb them. That'll help, as though our greatness is demonstrated by bombing hapless opponents. No, it's not. So, what does this mean for you in the Caucasus? Has anything changed for the better in Azerbaijan? I haven't seen any evidence for it.
Mm.
And I think Mr. Putin has exercised considerable restraint there. The only thing that he has done is shut off a lot of the imports that sustained the organized crime networks that the Azeris had operating in southern Russia. But beyond that, I haven't seen much happen. Have you?
No, I think Russia and Azerbaijan went through a difficult period in their relations, but now they seem to be doing better. But since you're bringing this up, there was a peace agreement negotiated between Armenia and Azerbaijan by President Trump in August in Washington, and
Right.
it was presented as a huge achievement, and I hope that it is. But so now Armenia is ceding its corridor, the southern border, a corridor from Azerbaijan to Turkey, to Trump's management. And very possibly Azerbaijan will have a share in that corridor. And American forces may be deployed on Armenia-Iran border in a country that already has a Russian military base. Does that strike you as a very stable situation if there is another confrontation with Iran to have American troops on the Iranian border in Armenia next to a Russian military base? Is this a power keg or how would you call this?
No, I think it's ill-advised. But then again, we have a government with no sense of limitations.
Mm.
In other words, something that characterizes Putin's thinking and behavior is a profound sense of the limits of Russian power and resources. He does not delude himself,
Mhm.
but I'm afraid President Trump does. I think you have to keep in mind that that's because we are historically, and certainly in our mental outlook, a maritime power and
Yes.
an aerospace power. We are not really a land power. So there's no sense of the tyranny of distance and the problem with putting soldiers at risk in an area like that over which we have very limited control. Let's face it. I think it was a very dumb idea. I remember when I was involved in the Dayton Peace Accords, uh, I was standing next to the senior military leader of the delegation, and he was getting instructions from Secretary Perry, who was then the Secretary of Defense. And Perry was a very, very sharp individual. And he said, now remember certain things. First of all, we don't want, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. In other words, if we don't get agreement, it's because it's bad. That's okay. Secondly, we don't want any Danzig corridors. In other words, we don't want any non-contiguous island outposts somewhere. And then third, we don't want any commitment of U.S. ground forces on a permanent basis or even a semi-permanent basis in the Balkans. It's not an area of vital strategic interest to the United States.
Yes.
Hello, gosh, if only we had that kind of rationality and thinking going on. But what distorts our view of the world right now is really Israel. We are heart and soul bound to the Israeli state, and we are absolutely in the clutches of the billionaires in the United States who want us permanently committed to Israel. Whether we want to admit it or not, we really are committed to the Greater Israel Project. So even though the Israelis are continuing to kill Palestinians every so many days, hours, more Palestinians are killed, more infrastructure is destroyed. A friend of mine said, what is there left to destroy? Well, apparently there was enough left to destroy that they went in and destroyed more infrastructure. The events on the West Bank are picking up pace, and people there are being killed or driven out. So none of that has fundamentally changed. In fact, we're simply walking away from any discussion of it and pretending that there is a peace accord in place that's meaningful when it isn't. The disappointing part is that the Peninsular Arabs, with all of their money, seem to have turned away from the Palestinians and cut whatever deals they thought were appropriate that guarantee their continued survival and power and to enrich themselves in perpetuity. But there are a couple of interesting developments, and I'd appreciate if you would talk a little bit about them. Iran, of course, has turned into what people are largely describing as increasingly an impregnable fortress. It's becoming something that if you attack it, you're probably not going to be successful. And you risk being destroyed if you do. That means that Israel can do nothing without us, because if we're not going to join in at their and make ourselves available to them, there's no chance for success against Iran. But there's something else happening, and the Israelis are now talking openly about, over the long term, they think the most dangerous enemy they face is Turkey. This is an undercurrent inside Israel, fear of the Turks. Now, I happen to have agreed with them. I said when my many trips to Israel, you continue to focus on Iran. Iran is not what you think it is. 40 years have passed, the place has changed. Conceivably, you could do business with them and get along with them. Of course, the Israelis, if they can't dominate you, they don't want to do business with you. And I said, you've got to watch Turkey. Turkey is not what it appears to be. Ataturk has long since vanished. You have a different regime in power, and the population is very hostile to Israel. Well, now they've begun to pick up on that. What is the impact of an increasingly hostile Turkish state to Israel on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia in the Caucasus?
Well, I could offer some of my thoughts, but of course you would certainly know much more than I do. It seems that with this new corridor and Armenia submitting to Turkey and Azerbaijan and Russia being forced out, or that's what the West would like to happen, we may have a super Turkey. We may have a super powerful regional, potentially even a global power, as Erdogan would want it to be. Turkey basically fusing with Azerbaijan or creating some kind of a confederation because they're saying we are one people, two states. Then you have a super powerful state on three seas, on the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Caspian, the strategic importance of the straits, plus the huge Turkish military, plus the gas and oil reserves of Baku. That's going to be an incredibly powerful regional force, and it's going to collide with someone. That someone could be Russia, that someone could be Iran or Israel. Which direction that's going to go in, I mean, you would know more about it. I think the U.S. will probably not allow two of its closest allies to collide, and would probably facilitate some kind of a sphere of influence agreement whereby they would just divide up the region and agree on some buffer zones and some spheres of influence. I would think, that's my speculation, that the US would not allow Israel and Turkey to collide. It's the closest, these are the two closest allies of the US in this region. I think they would just make sure they divide it up to push Iran and Russia out. That's what I would think.
Well, I think ideally that's probably what the Israelis would like.
Yes.
But the Turks have a problem with that, and that is that they are doing a land office business with Russia. The Russians are building critical infrastructure inside Turkey, not the least of which is a nuclear power plant.
Yes.
And they want to continue to do business with the Russians. The other thing is that while we are still viewed as powerful, they live next to Russia.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between the United States that has to travel thousands of miles, assemble forces, and then launch attacks, and Russia that commutes to the fight. Russia is there.
Yes.
And I went back with somebody, we were trying to count the numbers of wars between the Ottoman Turks and the Russians, dozens.
Yeah, more than a dozen.
And they were almost always disastrous for the Turks. And I don't think the Turks want to have a war with the Russians under any circumstances. Now, you've had Mr. Netanyahu publicly threaten Russia and Putin on more than one occasion, saying that, we're not afraid of you, and if you do X, Y, and Z, we could respond. I think it's been made clear that the Israelis take the same view of Erdogan in Turkey. I think the Israelis are riding, to be blunt, as we say in English, very high in the saddle. They've got us under their thumb, and as long as they do, they think they can do and get away with anything. So this condominium of interest that you described between Turkey and Israel, which is an artificial construct birthed into existence by the United States, that could crumble quickly. You have members of Netanyahu's cabinet talking openly about seizing Damascus. The Israelis have pushed to the very limit in southern Syria, and the Israelis, as you know, are strong backers of the Kurds, as are we. But frankly, the Israelis are even more important to the Kurds than we are because they provided them with technology, with weapons, and help, and so forth. So the Kurds are sort of astride this corridor that runs from Israel all the way up to Azerbaijan. They're in the middle. The Kurds are going to cooperate as long as it's in their interest to do so. At the same time, you've got Mr. Erdogan, who regards the emergence of a de facto Kurdish state as an existential threat to the Anatolian Republic. I guess what I'm pointing to is I'm reluctant to make any long-term forecast other than potential disasters around the corner.
Yes.
And we are not as strong as we appear to be.
Yes.
You look at China right now and Russia, and I would add India to this as well. They have an interest in managing American decline. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, in some ways, we are viewed as this potentially destabilizing power that comes in like a bull in a china shop and destroys a lot of China, then, declares victory and leaves, if you're lucky. In most cases, we never go home. We stay. So the Russians and the Chinese don't want a war with the United States under any circumstances. So they look at us and say, how do we manage this dangerous, unstable, unpredictable, irrational power called the United States, particularly as it tends to be on the way down? Remember that was the view that many people had of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. And that became pretty clear in the 1700s. I mean, frankly, after the Treaty of Karlowitz, and the defeat of the Turks in front of Vienna in 1683, from that point forward, it's an almost, the escalator is down and simply doesn't stop. People began trying to figure out how do we organize this and manage this effectively. I think they see us in a similar way. A lot of people in the United States don't appreciate it, but I think our withdrawal from Afghanistan wasn't the act of withdrawal, which everybody frankly thought should have happened a long time ago. That made perfect sense. But the conduct of that withdrawal was so chaotic, so incompetent, so amateurish
I could not
that
agree more.
it dramatically harmed us in the eyes of the world. Secondly, the Israelis don't say so publicly. They're disinclined to do so for obvious reasons, but they called upon Washington to end the 12-day war with Iran because Iran had not even made a dent in their arsenal of missiles. And the possibility was quite real that if the Iranians simply put pedal to the metal, as we say, in other words, 100% push down on the gas, that would have been the end of Israel. Then suddenly we get this demonstration strike that was a gift to President Trump from Iran. Please go in, do what you want. We won't shoot at you. And then, by the way, we turned to the Iranians and said, you can shoot at these and these locations in Qatar and elsewhere. That gave President Trump the opportunity for him to posture as having brought peace and happiness to everyone. Now, we all know that's nonsense. It doesn't make any difference. President Trump is very focused on optics. He likes that. But that could break down instantaneously, very quickly. We just don't know when, where, or how. And I think we have to assume that there's going to be another war in that region, and it's going to involve Iran and Israel. It's inevitable. Again, you go back to Armenia. Where does Armenia fall in all of this? Well, Azerbaijan has placed itself in the Israeli camp. What if the Israelis and the Turks fall out between now and when the next war breaks out? What does Azerbaijan do? I don't know. I know that Azerbaijan is overrun with MI6 and CIA, who always have a permanent interest in destabilizing Central Asia in the hopes of harming Russia. So that's ongoing. I don't know. But the point is, anybody who insists that we are somehow or another on the threshold of goodness and peace based upon this agreement that was brokered by President Trump between Azerbaijan and Armenia is delusional.
I understand, Colonel. And my last question, since we only have a few more minutes, in short, if you were Armenian, would you believe those propagandists that work? You already mentioned the MI6 and the CIA. They have a lot of public media outlets in Armenia that are using Western funds to carry on with their propaganda. What they're telling us is, don't worry, just sit back. The U.S. is going to come in. The U.S. will provide for your security. The U.S. will enforce the peace agreement and protect you. Would you believe that if you were Armenian?
No, not at all. For the very simple reason that ultimately, when things go bad for us, we do exactly what the British did historically. We sail away. We fly away. Armenia is what, 7,000 miles from the United States?
Very far.
I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And I think we are very reliant on a slender thread to connect us. That slender thread is American air power. And right now we have another president who is thrilled with the use of long-range strategic bombing and believes that that is our trump card, as he would call it. Okay, I don't. And I think it's only a matter of time until those are shot down in a very demonstrable way. And suddenly the myth of American air power, its invincibility and invulnerability will go away. So no, I think, I have visited many countries and sat down with the leaders of many different countries. And one of the things I try to tell all of them, and I got absolutely nowhere, by the way, when I talked to people from the Baltic states. And I told them the same thing that the Prussians and then subsequently the Germans did, which is, look, you live next to Russia. Now, you may not like the Russians, but it's in your interest to get along with them. So don't expect us to go to war for you against Russia. Russia is much closer to you than Russia is to us. The difficulties that we would have in maintaining your independence with military power are enormous. And that was something that the Germans said repeatedly to the people in the Baltic states. They loved the people in the Baltic states. They wanted to support them in any way they could, but they kept drawing this line saying, look, this is not reasonable. You can't expect us to ride to your rescue. It just isn't reasonable. Now, Hitler does, and we know how long that lasted. But of course, he had enemies on multiple fronts. Today, I think the same thing is true for anybody in the Caucasus. Get along with your neighbors to the extent that you can. Can you get along with Azerbaijan? Well, that's a tough one, especially when you're wedged in between Turkey and Azerbaijan.
Right.
It also goes back to the historic question of if those forces arrayed against you are stronger than you are, where can you turn for help and support that could be reliable? Inevitably, I think you turn back to Moscow.
Right.
The question is, what will Moscow do at this stage? So I hope that we can bring an end to the war in Ukraine, because I think that would be good for the Caucasus. I think that would be good for Armenia. I have to become a believer in that, though.
Right.
I'm still skeptical. It's always good to be skeptical in these matters, but if that were to happen, that would be good. And we should welcome it.
Thank you, Colonel. As usual, it's fascinating to talk to you. I could listen to you for hours. Sadly, we're down to 1 minute. Thank you again, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you, Colonel.
All right.
It's
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure. Thank you.